We've talked a lot about the learning process and mastery and some of the obstacles that we as humans have to really taking on new information. And a lot of it has to do with ego, a lot of it has to do with attachments. We've talked about sound bites in our team and that kind of stuff. And those are, I don't know, those are kind of interesting things to discuss, and they're emotionally charged things to discuss. But here's kind of another one, something that can get in the way. What makes me think of, here's a specific story. I was 96, and I was teaching, I was doing a day-long biomechanics thing, exercise mechanics thing, and we did one in Tokyo and one, I can't remember what the other one was, one of those bullet train rides away. Anyway, and when you're teaching over there, of course, you have a translator because I'm not fluent in Japanese version of exercise mechanics. I'm barely fluent in English version of exercise mechanics. So anyway, this translator, I had him a couple years in a row, 96 and maybe 97 when I was over there, and he was a pretty big guy, Japanese guy, who spoke English well. And I think his background, I think he was a PT, and I think he was a CSCS, and he was a sports-oriented rehab guy. And I think, come to think of it later, I think in hindsight, I think he was mad he wasn't the one doing the presentation. Maybe that was, anyway, here's the story. So I do this thing, and it sucks being translated, because you, in essence, across an 8-hour day, you talk for 4 hours and you have to listen for 4 hours to what, hopefully they're translating it correctly, but feels like you're not doing anything half the time, because you're not. And then sometimes there's another thing. My sentence is this long, his sentence is this long. Then when my sentence is this long, his is this long. I'm like, is this all working out the way it's supposed to? It's weird. But anyway, there was a press conference at the end of the day, and so I don't know why, but when these often they have a press conference. And so there's some people related to the field, I guess, some reporters, and so he again is translating their questions to me and my answers to them. Somewhere in the middle of this press conference, without a question from the audience, from the reporters, he turns to me and says, today when you were talking about, and I don't remember what it was, I just remember the confrontational tone and addressing of me that he did. He was like, today when you were talking about such and such, you didn't bring up this, and you didn't bring up this, and you didn't bring up this. Why? And I was kind of sitting there, I was kind of like, not so much taken aback, but like, what does this have to do with the press conference? And what is it? What I started thinking was, and I said this, relative to that subject matter and everything else we talked about today, especially in the 4 hours I had to do an 8-hour presentation, there's a lot of things that I didn't bring up on every single topic that we discussed. The fact that you recognize 2 or 3 of them really is not that much to your credit. What it seems like is that you wanted to be the man. And you actually didn't appreciate the value of the things I was talking about. And here's the thing, one of the first things when you're trying to speak to a group of people is, number one rule, understand your audience. There's not too much reason to say something that extends beyond their grasp. I guess you could sometimes if you're preparing them for what comes next, if it's a foreshadowing, but knowing your audience is critical. Triaging your information based upon what they need to know now, and then progressing your next statement based upon, and if I give you a list of 10 things, and you only understand 5 of them, why didn't I just give you the 5? And then say, and there's a bunch more stuff. But it's just interesting, all the things that, excuse me, can alter why you say what you say. And it's funny out there in the world that we feel entitled or required to find the holes in what's being said rather than looking at things necessarily for their value and how it can help me or my clients or education. What are some other big things? Not everything that's applicable is appropriate for every conversation or presentation. Context becomes a huge thing, and not every example is appropriate for the specific context that we're talking about. I don't know. What's the goal of the presentation? There's all kinds of reasons why you might edit what you're trying to say. And I think one of the bottom lines here there's a couple things that pop in my mind. This quote that pops in my head that says, sometimes it's more important to actually have something to say than to just need to say something. Because then we open our mouths when really we probably shouldn't. And it's of no redeeming value. That's an interesting thing. Another thing that's interesting along the way when people start going, commenting on what you're saying, rather than listening to the reasons and the rationales why, they start going, well, I don't see anything wrong with that. I don't see why that's not a good exercise. I don't see why that's contradicted for ACLs. I don't see. So if you don't see it, are you saying, help me, I don't see it? Or are you attempting to say, my statements are invalid because you don't get it? Well, that's a really interesting thing. And I got to tell you, one of the things that I am curious about, people are often speaking from their own personal experience. Well, it never bothered my shoulder. You should end that sentence with yet, that you know of, right? Because everything is temporal, is time-based. And it doesn't mean that because it hasn't hurt your shoulder, that your next client with the degenerated rotator cuff muscles, it doesn't mean it's not going to hurt them. So there's just a lot of interesting things about that. And I think another quote that pops into my head is, everybody is totally entitled to their opinion. But that absolutely does not mean they're remotely qualified to offer it to anybody. And that's a really important thing. You can have your opinion about which surgery that client should or shouldn't have. You're not remotely qualified to discuss it, offer it, say anything. Get over it. And you had that surgery once? Yay, you're a surgeon now. That's fantastic. I listened to opera one time. I ain't going to sing the shit, okay? So really, our egos just get a hold of us and go crazy. I see people also struggle in the educational process with a couple things. One thing is that they confuse the examples for the subject matter. So this specifically pops in my head. So I was teaching in the first incarnation of NASM back when we kind of some of the founding presenters created that thing, which is very different than it is now, as owned by the truck driving school. But there was a girl in the back of the room, and I was talking about moment arms. And here's an example of how a moment arm affects an exercise. And I said, okay, so let's look at, and I use, for an example of something, I try to use an augmented, a really dramatic example, so someone might be able to see it better. I said, let's look at a stiff-legged deadlift. So as you're standing up, the moment arm of resistance is really small, virtually nothing. As you head forward with this thing, you lower the weight, the moment arm of resistance dramatically increases. So the resistance is going up pretty dramatically as you're going down into what potentially is not necessarily your strongest position. And someone raises their hand and stands up in the back of the room and goes, I would never teach a stiff-legged deadlift. I went, well, that's not the subject matter. Sit down, shut up, try to pay attention to what we're doing here. That was just the most ridiculous thing. And it freaked me out that someone thinks their deal needs to affect everybody else in the room. Paid the same thing. Everybody else in the room is really who I apparently need to be talking to, because this person completely missed the subject matter. You know, the first person to question is always yourself. When you think you found a mistake in someone else's shit, the first person for you to question is you. I try to live by that all the time. So here's a couple other things, final things. I hear people say this. I heard it specifically with the squat proportions thing. Some people discussing it. Oh, did you hear about the squat proportions thing? And this guy goes, well, that's not a real thing. I've never heard of it. So there's a lot of stuff you haven't heard of. There's a lot of stuff I haven't heard of. If you're really sure you've heard of everything, you might need to check into a mental hospital. There's something pathological about that. That's really, really, really scary. I can't even believe someone would say that. Sometimes they come up with this question, well, if that's true, how come I haven't heard of it? Well, it's like, dude, I don't know. Have you been in a cave? Are you completely anti-new information? Do you only want to hear things that confirm what you already know? Because most people don't want to hear stuff that conflicts with it. I don't know why you didn't hear it. Are you pretending that because you didn't hear it, it's not true? That it's not an engineering fact, a biomechanical fact? If you're saying that, you might need to rethink your question. Anyway, there's a million obstacles to learning. There's just some that pop up in my life popped up over the past 30 years of attempting to teach this stuff. And some of them make me chuckle, and some of them make me remember how mad I got. And anyway, maybe you can do something with those in your own life and in your own teaching and with clients and being a student.